I remember the exact moment my world split in two. It was a Tuesday in October, and I had driven 40 minutes to surprise Jenny at the base. She'd been working late every night that week, missing dinner, missing our daughter Lily's bedtime stories, missing everything. I had a thermos of her favorite coffee and a foil-wrapped plate of the pot roast she loved. I felt like a good husband. I felt like a man doing the right thing. I stepped into the officer's lounge and heard her voice before I saw her. Jenny was laughing, that full, unguarded laugh I hadn't heard in months, and Deputy Colonel Richard Hartley was standing close enough to her that his shoulder brushed hers. That alone I might have survived. People laugh. Shoulders touch. But then Richard leaned in and said something low, and Jenny touched his arm the way she used to touch mine, and I understood in about 2 seconds what I had apparently been too blind to understand for God knows how long. I stood there with a thermos in one hand and a plate of pot roast in the other, and the world did not spin or tilt or do anything dramatic. It just went very still. Very quiet. Like the moment before a car crash when your brain has already understood what's coming but your body hasn't caught up yet. I set the food down on a side table and I walked out before either of them saw me. That was the night I should have confronted her. I know that now. But I drove home, put Lily to bed, sat on the kitchen floor for 2 hours in the dark, and told myself I had misread it. Jenny was a colonel. She was disciplined, principled, decorated. She had a Bronze Star and a framed commendation from the Secretary of the Army. She was not a woman who did things like this. I kept telling myself that lie for 3 more weeks. The truth about Jenny and me is that I loved her the way some people love things that were designed to outlast them. I was a landscape architect, not military, and when we met at a charity gala 8 years ago, she was a captain with sharp eyes and a handshake that made you understand she was not testing you, she had already decided. We dated long distance for 2 years while she was stationed overseas. I waited. I sent packages. I learned to cook because it gave me something to do with my hands during the stretches of silence when communication was restricted. When she came back, I proposed. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I built my business around her schedule, took the contracts closest to whatever base she was assigned to, restructured my entire professional life so that our daughter would always have at least one present parent. I was not resentful about it. I believed we were a team. I believed that what I gave up, she understood and honored. I was wrong about almost everything. The moment I knew for certain, the moment that turned the quiet grief inside me into something with teeth, happened because of my mother. My mother, Diane, had driven up from Richmond to visit us for the weekend. She was 63, soft-spoken, a retired schoolteacher who brought homemade ginger snaps and always remembered that Lily liked her stories with voices. She was the kind of woman who apologized for existing in too much space. She was gentle in a way that the world has a tendency to punish. Jenny had a small dinner gathering on the Saturday, 3 officers from the base, Richard Hartley among them, and their spouses. I cooked. I always cooked for these things. My mother helped, moving quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, setting bread rolls in the basket, refilling water glasses. She was trying to be useful. She was trying to be welcome. Halfway through the meal, Richard made a comment about the sauce. Not a compliment, a correction. He said it with the particular tone of a man who has confused being in uniform with being infallible, and my mother, who had spent 30 years managing classrooms of 30 students without raising her voice, quietly said she thought it tasted fine. Richard looked at her for a moment. Then he said, loud enough for the table to hear, no offense, but no one asked the help. The table went silent. I put my fork down. My mother's face did what my mother's face always did when she was hurt, it went very carefully blank, the way you pull shutters across a window. I looked at Jenny. Jenny, my wife. Colonel Jennifer Reeves. The woman with the Bronze Star and the commendation from the Secretary of the Army. The woman who had told me on our wedding day that she would protect what mattered. She looked at Richard, and then she looked down at her plate, and she said nothing. She picked up her wine glass and she took a sip and she redirected the conversation to some logistics discussion about the base's upcoming inspection. She let it happen. She watched it happen and she smoothed it over like it was an inconvenient spill rather than a man insulting her mother-in-law at her own dinner table. I excused myself to check on Lily. I stood in my daughter's doorway for a full minute watching her sleep, this small person who was half me and half Jenny, and something inside me finished breaking. I waited until the guests left. My mother had gone to bed early, and Lily was asleep, and it was just Jenny and me in the kitchen, and I told her what I was going to say. You let him do that, I said. She was rinsing glasses. She didn't stop. Richard can be abrasive. He didn't mean it badly. He called my mother the help. He made a poor choice of words. Jenny. I kept my voice flat, because if I let it go it would become something I couldn't take back. He humiliated her at our table. In our home. And you sat there. She set a glass down and turned around, and I saw it on her face, not guilt, not remorse, but something that looked almost like irritation, like I was the one creating the problem. Liam, Richard is my deputy. There is a political dynamic at play that you don't fully understand. I can't publicly undercut him over a dinner table comment. It wasn't a comment. It was a cruelty. And she is my mother. I'll talk to him Monday. You'll talk to him Monday, I repeated. Yes. I looked at my wife, really looked at her, the way you look at someone when you're trying to find the person you thought was there, and I said, something has been wrong for a long time, Jenny. And I need you to tell me the truth about what it is. She didn't answer right away. She picked up the glass again and finished rinsing it and set it in the drying rack. Then she said, I'm tired, Liam. Can we do this another time? No, I said. We can't. What followed was not a confession in the romantic sense. It was not tears and broken apologies and the theatrical collapse of pretense. It was more like a filing cabinet opening, document by document. She admitted that she and Richard had grown close. She used that word, close. I asked her to be specific. She said there had been an emotional connection that had crossed some lines. I asked her again to be specific. She looked at me with something that might have been shame and said, yes, it had been physical. How long? I asked. 7 months. 7 months. Lily had started second grade 7 months ago. I had repainted the hallway 7 months ago. I had thought things were fine 7 months ago. Where? I asked. Liam. Where, Jenny? She told me. It had been at the base, after late briefings. It had been at a conference in D.C. in August, when she had told me the conference ran an extra day and she'd need to stay over. I remembered that. I had taken Lily to the Science Museum. I had sent Jenny a picture of Lily pressing her palms against a static electricity globe, and Jenny had texted back a heart. You sent me a heart, I said. She said nothing. While you were with him, you sent me a heart. She started to say something about how complicated it had been and how she hadn't meant for it to happen and how she had been under tremendous pressure and the deployment last year had changed her, and I held up my hand. Stop, I said. I don't want the explanation. Not tonight. I went to the guest room and locked the door and I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and I understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful that I was done. Not angry yet, that would come later, in waves, 4 weeks. But done in the fundamental sense, the way a window is done when the frame cracks. It can be patched and it can hold for a while but it will never be what it was. I called my attorney, Daniel Frost, the next morning from my car. He was the kind of lawyer who spoke quietly and billed efficiently and did not waste time on sympathy when action was more useful. I told him what had happened, all of it, including the dinner, including Richard's comment, including Jenny's silence. I told him I wanted to begin divorce proceedings and I told him that primary custody of Lily was non-negotiable. Daniel said we needed to document everything. He said we should move carefully and quickly because Jenny's rank and the legal complexity of a military divorce required precision. He said, specifically, that I should not do anything dramatic before we were ready to file. I said I understood. I also, very quietly, began making notes. I had always been organized, it was why I was good at my job, why clients trusted me to manage complex long-term projects. I knew how to build a record. I noted dates, reconstructed timelines, identified the DC trip, compiled the text message thread from that week where Jenny had sent routine husband and wife messages while being with another man. I reached out to 2 people who had been at base functions with Jenny and Richard and whose observations I thought might be relevant. I was not reckless. I was careful. I was building something load-bearing, and load-bearing things require a solid foundation. I did not tell Jenny what I was doing. I did not move out of the house. I continued cooking dinner. I continued being present for Lily. I told my mother what had happened in a quiet phone call on a Tuesday afternoon, and my mother was silent for a long time and then said, "Oh, Liam," in a voice that made me feel 7 years old, which was both terrible and necessary. She did not say she told me so. She never would. She was not that kind of woman. 3 weeks after the dinner, I filed. Jenny received the papers at the base. Daniel had coordinated the timing carefully. I was at the school pickup line when she called me, and I let it ring, and I sent her a text that said, "My attorney will be the point of contact going forward. Lily and I are staying in the house for now. Please communicate through Daniel." She called 4 more times. I did not answer. She came home that evening and I was at the kitchen table with Lily, working on a puzzle, and Jenny stood in the doorway in her uniform and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something raw and off balance, like a person who has walked into a room and found the furniture rearranged. "You filed," she said. "Yes. You didn't talk to me first." "I talked to you 3 weeks ago," I said. You were tired. Lily looked up from the puzzle and said, "Hi, Mom," and Jenny had to hold herself together, visibly, with effort. "Can we talk about this?" Jenny asked. "Tomorrow," I said. "Tonight is puzzle night." She went upstairs. Lily pressed a piece into place and said, "Daddy, does this one go here?" And I said, "Yes, Bug, it does," and I helped her find the edge pieces, and for 30 minutes the world was nothing more than a cardboard picture of a lighthouse being assembled piece by piece on a kitchen table. The paperwork was filed. The process began. And then the second thing happened, the thing I had anticipated but which still, when it arrived, made me grip the steering wheel hard enough to leave marks. Richard Hartley's wife, Connie, called me. She had found out. I don't know how. I had not contacted her directly, had no intention of doing so, but information in a military community travels in ways that civilian logic can't always trace. Connie was a sharp, contained woman, a pediatric nurse, and when she spoke on the phone she was very quiet and very precise, like someone performing surgery in a small space. She said, "I need to know what you know." I told her. I sent her the documentation I had, the timeline, the DC conference, the text thread. I sent it because she asked and because it was her right and because I was not in the business of protecting Richard Hartley. Connie filed her own papers within the week. What happened next happened without any direct action on my part, which was exactly the way Daniel had advised it should go. Connie went to the base's inspector general with evidence of the relationship. Military law treats officer misconduct, particularly fraternization and conduct unbecoming, with significant seriousness. Richard was facing not just the end of his marriage but a formal investigation that could cost him his rank, his pension, the career he had built his entire identity around. I did not orchestrate this. I provided documentation to a woman who had every right to it. The consequences that followed were Richard's own, built brick by brick over 7 months of choices he made while sitting at my dinner table and calling my mother the help. When I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Richard had been formally reprimanded and removed from his position as deputy, I felt something I don't have a perfect word for. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the sensation of a splinter finally working its way out. Jenny tried many things in the weeks that followed. She tried the direct approach first, appearing at the house and asking to talk, calmly and rationally, about what a divorce would do to Lily, about whether we might consider counseling, about whether I had thought through what I was doing to our family. I told her I had thought about almost nothing else for weeks and that I believed what I was doing was correct. She argued. I listened. I did not change my position. She tried grief next. She sent long messages, not through Daniel, through my personal phone, which I had not blocked because Lily needed us both to be accessible, about how the affair had been a symptom of something larger that she took responsibility for, about how she missed our life, about how she understood the damage but wanted to repair it. The messages were articulate and detailed and I believed they were sincere, which somehow made them worse rather than better. A sincere accounting of how you burn down a house does not unburn it. She showed up at my mother's door in Richmond on a Saturday morning. This one I found out about afterward, from my mother, who had answered the door in her housecoat and listened to Jenny for 20 minutes on the front step before quietly saying, "Jenny, I don't think this is where you need to be having this conversation," and closing the door. My mother called me afterward and said, "She looked terrible, Liam." There was something careful in her voice, not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it, the particular compassion of a woman who cannot help but notice when another person is suffering. "I know, Mom," I said. "Are you sure about all of this?" "Yes," I said. "I'm sure." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Then I'm with you." The legal process moved at its own speed, which is to say slowly, with intervals of paperwork and waiting interrupted by occasional hearings that required me to sit in a room with Jenny and her attorney and manage my face. Jenny had hired a family law specialist, a woman named Patricia Welch, who was thorough and not unkind and who seemed, in moments, to find her own client's situation genuinely difficult to defend. The custody question was the center of everything. I had been the primary caregiver for most of Lily's life, the one who attended school events, managed medical appointments, made dinners, supervised homework, maintained the rhythms that children require. Jenny's career was demanding in ways that had always worked out, in practice, to me being the default parent. This was documented in school records, in medical records, in the testimony of Lily's teacher and pediatrician, both of whom I had spoken with through Daniel's guidance. Jenny did not contest this so much as she tried to reframe it, arguing that her military commitments, which were structural and not chosen, should not be used against her as a parent. Patricia Welch made this argument well. The judge acknowledged it. And then the judge reviewed the records and granted me primary physical custody with a generous visitation schedule for Jenny, and Jenny sat across the courtroom and absorbed this with the discipline of someone who has been trained to absorb things that hurt. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt, mostly, like someone who had been underwater for a long time and had finally broken the surface. The name was a separate matter, and I want to be precise about it because I've had to explain it several times and I want to explain it correctly. When Lily was born, Jenny and I had discussed names. Jenny's career carried her name professionally, and we had agreed, thoughtfully, at the time, to give Lily the last name Reeves Calloway, a hyphenate that combined Jenny's name with mine. It had seemed, then, like an expression of partnership. After the divorce proceedings began, I petitioned the court to change Lily's name to Calloway. Not to erase Jenny. Not out of anger, though anger was present. Out of clarity. The Reeves in that hyphenate had always referred to something I believed was true, a partnership of equals, a family built on mutual respect and honesty, and that thing did not exist. The name Reeves had been extended to my daughter in good faith based on a contract that was broken not by me but by Jenny, over 7 months, in the most deliberate and sustained way imaginable. Jenny's attorney objected strenuously. Jenny herself, in a rare direct communication through a brief she submitted to the court, wrote that removing her name from her daughter felt like an erasure, like a punishment, like something she would carry for the rest of her life. I read that brief 3 times. It was not wrong about how it felt. But I thought about Lily, who would grow up, and who would one day understand what the names meant and where they came from, and I thought about what I wanted her to understand about identity and truth and what we put our names on. The court approved the change. Lily became Lily Marie Calloway. Jenny's face in the courtroom when that decision was read will stay with me for a long time. It was not a dramatic expression. It was the expression of someone receiving news they already knew was coming and finding that the arrival is still, somehow, worse than the anticipation. The months that followed were the hardest ones, and also the most clarifying. I restructured my practice. I had spent years taking smaller, closer contracts to stay near the base, near Jenny's schedule, near the particular shape that her career required our life to take. I stopped doing that. I bid on a major urban renewal project in Charlotte that I had passed on twice before, and I won the contract, and working on it reminded me that I was genuinely good at what I did in ways that 7 years of subordinating my ambitions to someone else's schedule had quietly muffled. I started running again, something I had given up in the cramped years of early parenthood and never returned to. I ran in the mornings before Lily woke up, in the cold, along the river path near the house. I was not trying to transform myself. I was trying to have something that was only mine for 30 minutes each day, some motion that was not in service of anything except the simple animal fact of moving through the world. I talked to a therapist named Dr. Gregory Paulson, who had a calm practice and a talent for asking the one question per session that dismantled whatever comfortable structure I had built around my feelings. In the first month I went twice a week. By the 3rd month I had moved to once a week. By the 6th month I understood the difference between being healed and being finished, and I was working toward both. Lily adapted in the specific, heartbreaking, resilient way that children adapt, by continuing to be herself. She did her homework. She had a friend named Rosie who came over on Thursdays. She went through a phase of wanting to watch nature documentaries about ocean creatures and would deliver lectures at dinner about the intelligence of octopuses. She saw Jenny on the scheduled days, and when she came back from those visits she was usually quiet for an hour and then returned to being herself. I did not speak ill of Jenny to her. I answered her questions honestly at the level appropriate to a 7-year-old and told her that both her parents loved her and that the changes in our family were not her fault and not her responsibility. I said this so many times it became a kind of prayer. I ran into Richard Hartley once, at a gas station, about 8 months after the divorce finalized. He had been removed from his position, was facing the end of his military career, and the physical evidence of this was visible. He had the particular deflated quality of a man who built his confidence on status and found himself without it. He saw me and I saw him, and for a moment we were just 2 people at adjacent pumps. He said, "Calloway." I said, "Hartley." He looked like he wanted to say something more, an apology, maybe, or an explanation, some sentence that would organize what had happened into a shape he could live with. I watched him look for it and not find it. I finished fueling my car and got in and drove away. I did not feel anything in particular. That, I had learned, was its own kind of arrival. The final encounter with Jenny happened 14 months after we separated. I had agreed to meet her for coffee, at her request, in a neutral location, a coffee shop in the downtown area we had both used in the early years of our marriage. She had asked through Daniel's office, formally, and the formality of it made me think she needed something structured, so I agreed. She was there when I arrived. She was in civilian clothes, which still surprised me after so many years of seeing her almost exclusively in uniform. She looked thinner and more tired than she had during the proceedings, and when she stood to greet me there was none of the precise, controlled posture I associated with her. She looked like a person in the process of rebuilding something from the ground up. We sat down. She had coffee waiting. She said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Of course." She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "I wanted to say some things that I couldn't say in a courtroom. Not because they change anything. I know they don't change anything. But because I need you to have heard them." I said I was listening. She said she had been unfair. Not just the affair, she was precise about this, but the years before it, in which she had consistently prioritized her career and her comfort over the partnership we had agreed to build. She said she had watched me restructure my professional life around her schedule and told herself it was fine because I seemed okay, when the truth was that she had stopped asking whether I was okay because the answer might have complicated things for her. She said what Richard said to my mother was unforgivable, and that her silence in that moment was something she would spend a long time accounting for. She said she understood why I had removed her name from Lily's, and that it was just, and that it hurt in a way she would not ask me to make easier for her. She said she was going to spend a long time being a better mother than she had been a wife, and she hoped I would let that be true. I listened to all of it. I did not cry. I did not reach across the table. I waited until she was finished and I said, "I believe you mean all of that." She said, "I do." I said, "That's going to matter, over time, for Lily. It's going to matter what you do with it." She nodded. I said, "But I need you to understand that I'm not who you need to say this to. I'm not the audience for your accounting, Jenny. What you do from here, whether you carry this well or badly, I genuinely hope it's well, for Lily's sake and for yours. But I'm not the one keeping score anymore." She looked at me for a long time. There was something on her face that was not quite grief and not quite peace, something intermediate, the look of a person receiving a verdict they had expected and still needed a moment to absorb. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. I finished my coffee. I told her Daniel would be the contact for any adjustments to the visitation schedule. I said goodbye. I walked out into the October afternoon, same month, different year, different men, and I got into my car and I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, and I noticed that I felt, underneath everything, essentially fine. Not happy in the uncomplicated way. Not unburdened. But fine in the specific, hard-won sense of a man who has walked through something difficult and come out the other side with his integrity intact and his daughter's hand in his and a project in Charlotte that he is genuinely proud of. I called my mother on the drive home. She answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well," I said. "I think it went well." "Good," she said. "Lily's here. She wants to tell you about a squid she saw on television." I laughed. It was real. "Put her on," I said. Lily came on the line and launched immediately into a detailed account of the bioluminescent properties of the deep-sea squid, delivered with the full authority of a 7-year-old who has done 2 minutes of passionate research, and I drove home through the October light listening to my daughter's voice and thinking that this specific ordinary miraculous thing, was what I had fought to keep. This was what the whole long battle had been for. 2 years later, the Charlotte project won a regional design award. I flew out to accept it, and Lily came with me, 8 years old by then, gap-toothed and opinionated, wearing the little dress my mother had sent her, and when I stood at the podium with the award in my hands, I looked out at the audience and thought about every version of myself that had existed in the years it took to get to this room. The men who drove 40 minutes with a thermos of coffee and a plate of pot roast. The men who sat on the kitchen floor in the dark. The men who listened to Richard Hartley call his mother the help and watched his wife say nothing. The men who called Daniel Frost the next morning. The men who ran along the river in the cold and answered his daughter's questions and built something, slowly, that was actually his. I thought about all of them and I felt no malice and no residue and no desire to look backward. Someone told me later that they'd heard Jenny had been reassigned to a post in the Pacific Northwest. That she was putting her considerable energy into her career and into her relationship with Lily, and that she was, by accounts, doing better. I heard Richard had left the military and was working somewhere in the private sector, starting over in middle age, carrying whatever it is that men carry when they've burned what they built. I did not feel satisfaction at his difficulty and I did not feel vindicated by Jenny's distance. I felt, mostly, the particular quiet of someone who has closed a chapter and found that the next one has already begun. Lily is 9 now. She still lectures me about ocean creatures. She has my mother's eyes and a stubbornness that is entirely her own. She goes to Jenny on scheduled visits and comes home and does her homework and argues with me about bedtime and is, in all the ways that matter, whole and loved and certain of her place in the world. I made her that. I protected that, through everything. My name is Liam Calloway. My daughter is Lily Calloway. We live in a house with a good kitchen and a backyard where I am, slowly, building a garden. We are fine. We are more than fine. The window, as it turns out, did not need to be patched. It needed to be replaced, something new, something clear, something that lets in the light without the crack running through it. That is what I built. That is what I kept.